As she tried her best to recover as quickly as possible, Claire felt small hands on her back and shoulders and heard a female voice echo in her ears, as if from a great distance. She wasn't sure how long she'd been wheezing and coughing before she could finally look up to see Stacy standing over her, looking concerned. Who? The teacher managed before going into another coughing fit. Stacy looked at her, tear stains and terror wrecking her usual pretty features. The goggle-eyed man, she said, voice trembling. He followed me here. What? I saw him in the restroom mirror back at school just before we left, Stacy told her. I didn't say anything because I thought it was just my imagination or something, but that was him. He's here. And he killed Brittany. And I didn't try to stop him. I just listened to her. Britt. Claire cleared her throat again. Though her voice was still scratchy, she seemed to be gaining some control over it. Brittany? Are you sure? Stacy nodded vehemently as tears began to form in her eyes again. Claire made a sharp intake of air and put her hand to her mouth in horror. She might have written off the young girl's statements as a cry for attention combined with hysteria brought on by stress, but she had already felt the bruises starting to form around her neck in the shape of her attacker's hands. It was all the evidence she needed to know that Stacy might very well be telling the truth. Okay, she rasped. Okay. We need to call the police and wake everyone up. She stopped short when Stacy gripped her arm. I tried to wake the other girls up in my room, Stacy said, shaking her head. They wouldn't. I was knocking on doors all the way down here. No one answered. I don't think they can wake up. Claire looked over at the hallway door and felt her heart begin to sink. We could still try the police, she said as she picked up the phone sitting under the front counter. With shaking fingers, she carefully pressed the buttons for 911 and put the receiver to her ear. At first, she thought she was hearing nothing at all. There was no dial tone, no ringing, no sound coming from the other side of the line. Thinking that the phone was completely dead, she was just about to put it back in its cradle when she noticed the soft hiss coming from the speaker, denoting an open line. Hello? If anyone heard her, they betrayed no sound, no answer in kind, no quickened breath, no soft chuckles of a prankster. Pure silence. The hiss seemed to reach out of the phone and crawl into Claire's ear, trying to tunnel its way down into her brain. With a grunt of disgust, she tore the receiver away and held it in front of herself as if it were a live thing, squirming between her fingers. Stacy had been nervously staring out the windows, watching out for any sign of the goggle-eyed man would return, but upon hearing Claire's movement, she turned to look at the older woman with a worried expression. For Stacy's sake, if not her own, Claire smiled back and tried to appear as if nothing was wrong. When the girl turned back to her vigil, the teacher pressed down the phone's disconnect and toggled it a few times. The open line remained, still menacing somehow without making a sound. She didn't bother dialing or saying anything. She simply listened to the silence until she couldn't stand it anymore. Slamming the phone back into its cradle a little harder than she'd meant to, Claire took Stacy by the shoulder and started to guide her back out into the parking lot. The phone is out. She purposefully refrained from using the word dead. We should go find the other teachers. Do you know what room they're staying in over there? When Stacy shook her head, Claire chewed on her bottom lip for a moment and made a decision. It was something of a risky move, but it had to be done. All right, she said. We'll have to go to the other motel then. Keep an eye out for anything, and if you see the masked man, just stay behind me, okay? Nodding her pigtailed head in understanding, Stacy pressed in close to Claire's side as they moved across the street. The older woman took note that whatever bravado Stacy might have shown in saving her before had completely disappeared. If what the girl had said was true and Brittany had been killed because she hadn't tried to defend the cheerleader, then the act of heroism had probably been fueled entirely by guilt, and unfortunately it didn't seem to be enough to get her through a second encounter. They looked both ways before stepping out onto the road, though it was mostly a pointless gesture. It was just as devoid of traffic as it had been since they'd arrived that evening, and with the strange events that were transpiring around them, it seemed that there was a chance it might remain empty until the police finally came through the next morning to pick up the cold bodies of the Lawndale High student body and faculty. Claire shoved the morbid thought out of her head just before she saw a hulking, shadowy shape ahead of them, backlit by the sodium lamps of the Erbie motel lot. She drew Stacy to a stop, and the two of them tried to discern the identity of the figure before proceeding. It was male, certainly, and seemed to be the same general build and height as the goggle-eyes man, but it was difficult to be sure. Stacy didn't seem to share Claire's doubts, however, as she clawed and twisted her fingers deep into the teacher's thick housecoat and let out a small whine. The man apparently heard the noise and turned his head, revealing a familiar face to the light. "Kevin!" The strain of shouting caused Claire to descend into another spasm of choking coughs. Kevin ran towards them, but as he moved away from the backlighting, they could see the camo coveralls and gloves that he was wearing. Stacy screamed and started trying to drag Claire away, causing Kevin to pull up short and hold his hands up. "Whoa, hey," he called out. "Miss Defoe and Stacy, it's just me, the QB." Claire gently pushed Stacy around so she was standing between the girl and the football player. "Yes, Kevin," she said sternly, "we can see that." "Hey, what's wrong with your voice? Do you, got a cold or something?" Kevin asked and looked around. "And, hey, how did I get over here?" Claire called his name, getting his attention back on her. "Kevin," she said, "what's the last thing you remember?" Oh, me and Britt were just, enjoying a little moonlight stroll." "It was a very nice moonlight stroll, if you know what I mean." He waggled his eyebrows at the women for a moment before realizing what he'd said. Not that you would," he quickly amended. "I mean, I don't even know what I meant. What did I mean? I don't know. No clue here." A feeling of surreality began to wash over Claire. "Kevin, where is Brittany?" He looked around himself with an expression of guileless confusion. "I don't know. She was just with me a second ago. Or was I with her a second ago? And why is my shoulder all hurty?" Claire gasped when he twisted around to look at his own back. She could see Stacy's nail file sticking out just below his shoulder, a small stain of blood soaking through the fabric surrounding it. Immediately putting aside the danger he might still pose, she moved forward only to be pulled back by Stacy. No, don't!" the girl pleaded, hanging onto Claire's sleeve. "He's the goggle-eyes man. He'll hurt you again." "Honey, I think he's just Kevin now," Claire tried to reason with her. "And Kevin's hurt. We need to get him fixed up and talk to him some more if we're going to figure out what's going on here, okay?" Stacy looked unconvinced, but she let go of the teacher's coat and meekly followed along as they approached the wounded boy. "No, Kevin, don't touch it," Claire said, pushing his hand away from the file. "If you take it out, you'll just bleed more. We'll take you to find some bandages first, and then we'll go look for Brittany together, okay?" Kevin beamed brightly at her. "Yeah, that sounds like a great idea," he said. "You know, for a teacher, you're pretty smart." Taking the backhanded comment in stride, she led the two teenagers toward the Erbie motel office. She felt fairly certain that the scene there would be much like it had been over at Nick's, but there was still a good chance that they'd find the first aid kit somewhere. "And if we're lucky," she thought, "if we're very, very lucky, we'll find that the phone works, the clerk is awake, that Brittany is fine, and that all of this has just been a big misunderstanding." "Hey," Kevin said as they walked up to the office door, "has anybody seen my mask?" The words on the page swam in Anthony's vision as he stared dully at the book in his hands. He felt his head start to nod forward, and he immediately jerked it back upright and shook it to clear away the fuzz that was settling over his mind. His jaw fairly cracked from the massive yawn he involuntarily let out. Trying to stay up after taking his medicine wasn't working out as well as he planned. That neurotic worry that he'd sleep literally like the dead still gnawed at his gut, but the longer he stayed awake, the more he came to realize that the worry simply wasn't enough. He was going to sleep whether he wanted to or not, and he would either do it uncomfortably in a motel chair or somewhat less uncomfortably in a motel bed. After marking his place and setting his book aside, he grabbed a plastic cup of water from the sink and set it on the nightstand next to his bed. He rubbed his eyes and yawned, then looked around the room one last time to make sure he hadn't forgotten anything. He grunted softly as he remembered to slip the paintball mask on before turning off the light, sliding into bed, and swiftly falling into a deep, dark sleep.